Mark Reynolds was a 35-year-old successful architect who had made a name for himself with innovative designs and a reputation for reliability. Born and raised in Seattle, he had always been grounded, cherishing his close-knit circle of friends and the stability of his suburban life. Mark was the kind of man who valued loyalty above all else. He had been married to Emily for 7 years, and their relationship, while not without its challenges, had been built on mutual respect and love. Emily was a 33-year-old freelance graphic designer, known for her artistic flair and vibrant personality. She had a knack for bringing warmth and color to every aspect of her life. Chris Thompson, 36, and David Morris, 34, had been Mark's best friends since their college days. Chris, a charming and successful entrepreneur, was known for his quick wit and larger-than-life personality. David, on the other hand, was a down-to-earth software engineer who preferred a quieter life but was equally close to Mark. Both men had their flaws, but their camaraderie with Mark had been a constant through various life changes. The four had often been seen together, from weekend getaways to celebrating milestones. They were a tight-knit group, the kind that seemed unbreakable, until that fateful evening. Mark had been burning the candle at both ends, working late into the night on a crucial project. The design for a high-profile skyscraper was at a critical stage, and he had promised his client that the blueprints would be finalized by the end of the week. Exhausted but determined, he finally decided to call it a night and head home, eager to spend some quiet time with Emily, who had always been a source of comfort for him. As he approached their suburban home, the familiar sight of their cozy 2-story house filled him with a sense of relief. He was looking forward to unwinding, but as he turned the key in the lock, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The house was too quiet. Emily was supposed to be home, working on her latest design project, but the silence felt heavy and wrong. Mark shrugged off his unease and stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloping him. He tossed his keys onto the hall table and made his way towards the kitchen, hoping to grab a quick snack before heading to bed. But as he approached the stairs leading up to their bedroom, the muffled sounds of laughter and moaning reached his ears. His heart raced, each beat echoing with growing suspicion. The sounds were unmistakable, intimate and throaty, filled with a mixture of pleasure and abandon. Mark's steps faltered. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and quietly ascended the stairs, following the sounds to their bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and he hesitated for a moment before pushing it open just enough to peek inside. The scene before him was so surreal that it took a few seconds for his brain to process what he was seeing. Emily, naked and seemingly in ecstasy, was entangled with Chris and David. The room was dimly lit by a bedside lamp, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Chris was positioned behind Emily, his face a mask of intense pleasure, while David was engaged with her from the front. The sight was both physically and emotionally overwhelming. Mark's breath caught in his throat as his mind struggled to reconcile the betrayal he was witnessing. He had trusted these men with his life, and here they were, violating the sanctity of his marriage. His hands clenched into fists, but he fought to remain calm, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Chris, noticing Mark's presence, turned his head with a smirk. His expression was one of amused surprise, as if he had been expecting Mark to join them. "Dude, join us," he said, his voice dripping with a mix of arrogance and casual disregard. "She's so wild, she can handle 3 Johnsons." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His initial shock transformed into a cold, calculated rage. Every fiber of his being wanted to confront them, to yell and demand answers, but he knew that would only escalate the situation further. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy with betrayal. Downstairs, Mark's mind raced. He felt a surge of adrenaline as he made his way to the garage. The betrayal was raw, cutting through his heart like a knife. He grabbed a duffel bag he had prepared for a recent hunting trip, the items inside now taking on a darker significance. He had a baseball bat, rope, and a tranquilizer gun, things he had never imagined using in such a way. As he drove away from the house, he found a grim sense of purpose in the cold night air. His emotions were a tangled mess of hurt, anger, and a desire for retribution. He had always prided himself on being the calm, collected one, but tonight he felt like a man on the edge, driven by a need for justice that bordered on vengeance. Returning to the house, Mark's footsteps were quiet but purposeful. He knew what he had to do, and he was determined to follow through. The betrayal had shattered his world, and he was about to unleash a storm on those who had torn his life apart. The evening had begun with the promise of a peaceful night, but it was about to turn into something far darker, a night of reckoning where the rules were his to define. The air outside was frigid, and the headlights of Mark's car cut through the darkness as he drove back towards his house. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one sharper and more insistent than the last. He had never imagined himself capable of the kind of retribution he was about to exact, but the sight of Emily with Chris and David had ignited a fire within him that was impossible to extinguish. Mark parked his car a few blocks away, out of sight of the house. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. The duffel bag in his trunk felt heavier than it had before, its contents now bearing the weight of his vengeance. He had never used the items inside for anything other than their intended purpose: sports, camping, hunting, but tonight, they were about to become instruments of his retribution. With grim determination, Mark walked back to his house. The street was eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. He approached the side door, which led to the kitchen, and used his spare key to let himself in. The house was still and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos that had filled it only hours before. He moved stealthily through the hallway, his footsteps barely making a sound on the hardwood floors. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing with a mix of adrenaline and dread. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused, listening for any sounds coming from the upper floor. The house seemed to hold its breath along with him, waiting for the next chapter in this unsettling drama to unfold. With the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, Mark climbed the stairs slowly and deliberately, each step echoing in the silence. He could still hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, a reminder of the normalcy that had once pervaded his life. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and he could see the flickering light from the bedside lamp casting strange shadows on the walls. He pushed the door open with the edge of his foot, making sure not to make any unnecessary noise. Inside, the scene had shifted dramatically. Emily, Chris, and David were no longer engaged in their earlier activities but were instead sitting in a disheveled, uncomfortable heap on the floor. The remnants of their previous intimacy were scattered around the room: crumpled sheets, discarded clothing, and a palpable sense of tension. Mark stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Emily's face went pale as she saw him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and regret. Chris and David looked up, their expressions a blend of confusion and apprehension. Mark could see the realization dawning on their faces. They knew something was coming, and it was going to be anything but pleasant. "Get up," Mark said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Now we're playing by my rules." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Chris and David exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Emily, still sitting on the floor, tried to speak, her voice trembling. "Mark, please." "Quiet," Mark interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I don't want to hear your excuses right now." With a sense of grim determination, Mark set the duffel bag down in the center of the room. He pulled out the baseball bat, its solid weight a comforting presence in his hands. The sight of it made Chris and David's eyes widen in fear, and Emily's pleas grew more desperate. Mark's plan was methodical and deliberate. He had thought about every detail, every possible reaction. He knew he had to maintain control, to make them understand the depth of his betrayal. He approached Chris and David, who were still sitting on the floor, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "Get up and move to the basement," Mark ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Chris tried to protest, his voice cracking with desperation. "Mark, come on, man, this isn't necessary." "Save it," Mark replied coldly. "You had your chance. Now, you're going to learn what it feels like to be on the receiving end of betrayal." With Mark leading the way, Chris and David slowly stood up, their movements stiff and uncertain. Emily, still sitting on the floor, looked up at Mark with tear-filled eyes, her expression one of utter helplessness. Mark could see the anguish in her face, but he couldn't bring himself to soften his stance. She had been complicit in this betrayal, and now she had to face the consequences along with Chris and David. Mark led them down to the basement, a dark and cluttered space that had long been relegated to storage. The basement was cold and damp, a fitting backdrop for the grim scene about to unfold. As they descended the stairs, the harsh overhead light flickered erratically, casting long shadows on the walls. Once in the basement, Mark set up a makeshift area in the center of the room. He took out the rope and began tying it to the sturdy beams overhead, creating a makeshift harness. Chris and David watched in silent fear, their earlier bravado completely gone. Mark's movements were precise and methodical, each knot tied with a grim sense of purpose. Emily, who had followed them down, watched in horror as Mark continued his preparations. She tried to reach out to him, her voice trembling with desperation. "Mark, please, just talk to me. We can work this out." "No," Mark said firmly. "There's nothing left to say. You made your choice, and now you'll have to live with the consequences." With the harness in place, Mark turned his attention to Chris and David. He approached them with the baseball bat, its presence a stark reminder of the retribution he had planned. He made them stand in front of the harness, their faces pale and drawn. "You'll be spending the night here," Mark said coldly. "Tied up and left to think about what you've done." Chris and David's eyes were filled with fear as Mark began to secure them in the harness. The ropes were tight but not cruelly so, designed to ensure they were uncomfortable but not in immediate danger. The process was methodical, each knot a symbol of Mark's anger and betrayal. As Mark worked, the silence in the basement was broken only by the occasional whimper or muffled cry. Emily's sobs echoed through the room, a haunting reminder of the pain that had led them all to this moment. Mark's anger was still palpable, but as he looked at Chris and David, he felt a twinge of something else, guilt perhaps, or regret. With Chris and David secured, Mark stepped back, surveying his work with a cold satisfaction. The basement was now a chamber of shame and suffering, a stark contrast to the comfortable home it had once been. Mark felt a sense of grim finality as he looked at the two men, their faces etched with fear and resignation. He turned to Emily, who was standing to the side, her expression one of utter despair. "You'll stay here with them," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "and you'll witness the consequences of your betrayal." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. She didn't protest, knowing that any further attempt to plead for mercy would be futile. As Mark turned to leave, he could hear her quiet sobs blending with the muffled sounds of Chris and David's discomfort. Mark closed the basement door behind him, sealing in the chaos and leaving the room to its grim purpose. He knew that what he had done would have lasting repercussions, but for now he was consumed by the need to see his revenge through to its bitter end. The night wore on, and the sounds from the basement grew quieter as exhaustion set in. Mark remained upstairs, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. He had exacted his revenge, but the price of his vengeance was a heavy one. The betrayal had been avenged, but at what cost? The scars of the night would remain, marking the end of a chapter and the beginning of a new, uncertain future. The early morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Mark's house, casting a cold, pale glow over the rooms. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. Mark had barely slept, his mind churning with the consequences of his actions. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, was magnified in his anxious state. He had spent most of the night pacing the floors, his thoughts a tumultuous mix of guilt and grim satisfaction. His revenge had been exacted, but the weight of what he had done was beginning to settle heavily on him. As dawn approached, Mark knew that he needed to address the aftermath of his actions, to confront the reality of the situation he had created. Downstairs, the basement door remained closed, sealing in the remnants of the night's turmoil. Mark hesitated before heading down, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he would find. The basement had been transformed into a chamber of retribution, and he knew that opening that door would reveal the full extent of the damage he had wrought. With a deep breath, Mark unlocked and slowly opened the basement door. The sight that met him was both haunting and sobering. Chris and David were still secured in the harness, their faces etched with discomfort and fear. The ropes had left marks on their skin, and their once proud demeanor was replaced with a subdued, almost pitiful resignation. Emily was sitting against the wall, her face streaked with tears. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hands clasped tightly together in a gesture of helplessness. She looked up as Mark descended the stairs, her expression a mix of relief and despair. Mark approached Chris and David, who looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hatred. Their eyes were filled with a silent plea for mercy, but Mark's resolve remained unshaken. He had come to see this through, and there was no turning back now. "I'm going to let you out," Mark said, his voice steady but cold. "But I want you to understand something. This isn't over." Chris and David exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of hope and apprehension. Mark moved methodically, untying the ropes with a careful, deliberate motion. As each knot was loosened, the men's muscles, stiff from hours of being restrained, began to relax. They winced as the blood flow returned to their limbs, their discomfort palpable. Emily watched in silence, her eyes never leaving Mark. She could see the toll that the night had taken on him, the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked. She wanted to speak, to plead for understanding, but she knew that her words would fall on deaf ears. Mark was beyond reason, consumed by the need for retribution. With Chris and David finally freed, Mark turned to Emily. "You'll be leaving with them," he said. "I don't want to see you here again." Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, please." "No," Mark interrupted. "There's nothing left to say. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences." Emily stood up slowly, her movements hesitant. She approached Chris and David, her expression a mixture of apology and resignation. The three of them made their way up the stairs, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. Mark followed them, his heart a tumult of conflicting emotions. As they reached the front door, Emily paused for a moment, turning back to look at Mark. There was a look of profound sadness in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the end of their relationship. Mark could see the pain and regret etched on her face, but he couldn't bring himself to offer any solace. With a final glance, Emily stepped out into the early morning light, followed by Chris and David. The three of them walked down the driveway, their heads bowed, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Mark watched them go, his heart heavy with a sense of finality. As the door closed behind them, Mark was left alone in the silence of his home. The house, once a sanctuary of comfort and familiarity, now felt cold and empty. The night's events had irrevocably changed everything, leaving behind a trail of broken trust and shattered dreams. Mark moved through the house in a daze, his mind replaying the events of the past hours. The memories were vivid and painful, each moment a reminder of the choices he had made and the consequences they had wrought. He could still hear Emily's sobs, see the fear in Chris and David's eyes, and feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He made his way to the bedroom, the scene of the betrayal that had set everything in motion. The room was still messy, a stark reminder of the night's chaos. Mark took a deep breath and began to clean up, his movements mechanical and detached. He wanted to erase the evidence of the pain and suffering, to return some semblance of normalcy to his life, but he knew that it was impossible. As he worked, Mark's thoughts drifted to the future. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The relationships that had once been the cornerstones of his life were now fractured beyond repair. His friendship with Chris and David was over, irreparably damaged by the betrayal and retribution, and his marriage with Emily was a thing of the past, a broken relic of a once happy life. By late morning, Mark had managed to restore some order to the house. The physical remnants of the night's chaos had been cleaned up, but the emotional scars remained. Mark knew that healing would take time, and he was uncertain of how to move forward. The trust he had once placed in his friends and his wife had been shattered, and rebuilding it would be a monumental task. He sat in the quiet of the living room, the weight of the past night hanging heavy in the air. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed harsh and unwelcoming, a stark reminder of the reality he now faced. Mark had hoped that by exacting his revenge he would find some semblance of closure, but instead he was left with a deep sense of emptiness. As the day wore on, Mark resolved to focus on the future, to find a way to rebuild his life from the ruins of the past. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, and that the scars of the night would linger long after the physical reminders were gone. But he was determined to move forward, to find a way to heal and to rebuild. The night of betrayal and retribution had changed everything for Mark Reynolds. The once tight bonds of friendship and marriage had been torn apart, leaving him to confront the consequences of his actions. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but Mark was prepared to face them, driven by a newfound resolve to reclaim his life and find a path to healing.